Good. I'll tell you all about it after this. Hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. As you may know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about medical devices, consider cannabis, or obsess over pharmacy, this is the podcast for you. I have to specify as a lawyer, this is not considered to be legal advice and should not be also considered to be clinical advice. So find a lawyer that's right for you and ask them for the advice. I do these podcasts because they are a lot of fun and because I find myself learning something new each time. However, it would be nice to know that people are listening. So if you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. If you want to find me, you want to reach out to me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Our podcast today is really kind of interesting because I have two separate directions I can take it. And the one I'm really interested in is the topic that was super hot in 2019, and we seem to have just ignored it for the last year and a half at this point, almost literally a year and a half at this point. I'm talking about the opioid crisis. So if you are a patient thinking about the opioid crisis, if you are a distributor, a pharmacist, a manufacturer, and are wondering what's going on with the opioid crisis, today's discussion should be really kind of interesting because it'll tell us what's going on, what's new, and where is it going? What lessons can we learn from this? Our guest today is the president and CEO of Whitelaw Compliance Group. He teaches law school remotely at Mitchell Hamlin and is the editor at Policy and Compliance Medicine Update. He is a person that I routinely reach out to for advice. He's incredibly smart, and as you can tell from the pipe, incredibly professorial. I think that's the right word for it. So our guest for today, Seth Whitelaw. Hey, Seth, how are you?
I'm good, Darshan. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you on. Let's talk a little bit about this course you're going to be teaching at Mitchell Hamlin, which is on the opioid crisis. So let's start with, well, we all know what the opioid crisis is, but is it something that has died down? Is there anything going on with it anymore, or is life hunky-dory at this moment?
No, life's not hunky-dory. It started to die down, but I would say at the beginning of this year and certainly in the last few months, seems to have taken on a life of its own. What we're seeing, not so much from the crisis perspective, but more from the litigation perspective. So we're seeing new litigants being brought in. We're seeing McKinsey as a consultant brought in, and Policus Health brought in for the work that they did primarily with Purdue Pharma. We have plenty of ongoing litigation in the MDL. There's a big case going. California has a separate action going on out there. So we're going to see a lot more in this space. We're not nearly done yet. It kind of took a hiatus and a backseat to the pandemic, but I think it's picking up again.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because you raised some interesting points. This idea of bringing in McKinsey or bringing in Publicis. That's a novel interpretation. I mean, I can totally see it under the False Claims Act because it's such a broad law that enables anyone who's in that chain to be brought in. But this is an unusual situation. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on there and why are these two companies being brought in?
Well, I think in particular, these two companies are being brought in because they, at least from the information that's available and the documents that have been revealed so far in the case, these folks, quite frankly, were major drivers behind Purdue's marketing campaign for OxyContin. They were the ones who suggested targeting high prescribers. They were the ones who were pushing the narrative that somehow OxyContin was less addictive, had less abuse potential, none of which is, when you look at the data, none of which pans out. So they were active players in this space. And I think you're also seeing they're being brought in because, again, as these cases churn their way through the system, the amount of money we're talking about is huge. the scope of liability is incredible. The companies themselves, and the distributors, there isn't enough money, even if you bankrupted them all, to pay for this. So I think states and others are looking for ways to bring in other people with potentially deep pockets.
So this is an interesting comment you made, which is it's not about the money. Just like it.
God bless you.
Excuse me. I have to, even if it's online, I have to clarify these are allergies. This is not COVID. But I feel like we now need to justify that. We live in that world. But let's talk a little bit about that. You talk about if there's not enough money to pay for everything. Let's start with the beginning, which is these companies are asserted to be the companies that basically pushed this product and asserted that it has limited addiction potential, if you will. I guess my question to you is, what is the gap? What is the difference between advertising and pushing a product? And because everyone's allowed to advertise, is it the false and misleading component that made it problematic, or was there something more to it?
No, I think it's the false and misleading component, Darshan. I really do. I think the real issue here is they were saying things that they knew or should have known were not accurate. And so I don't think anybody has a problem with companies pushing, advertising their products, being truthful about their products, being truthful, but that requires that sort of, as you well know from the food and drug work we've done together, the fair balance concept. You have to give the positives and the negatives. You can't just give positives. That doesn't work. And I think what was happening, from what I've seen, certainly, they were simply emphasizing the positives and ignoring the negatives.
So let's talk about that, because you're talking about, let's take Publicis. I've never quite pronounced this right. Publicis, I believe, is how it's pronounced. But let's take them for argument's sake. And to be clear, I don't work with them. They've never been a client.
Nor here.
Yeah, and I haven't looked into their specific case in enough depth to be able to comment on it. So we're talking about these as abstract entities and where the direction is right now around compliance. So the question I have is, number one, is this an indication that the DOJ and the OIG and state inspector general's offices are now open and interested in exploring more cases against ad agencies and consulting companies? Or is this a one-off, you think, just because of how it's played out?
Well, I think it's an egregious example, Darshan, but if I were a consultant, and I am a consultant, it gave me pause as well, to the extent of, to what extent are you as a consultant aiding and abetting bad behavior? So making sure that your advice is sound, making sure that you're giving them all the risks, and thinking about those instances where, if your advice isn't going to be taken and they're not going to listen to you, do you need to walk away? And I think for all consultants, I think it really gives us pause to think about how we interact with our clients and exactly what it is we're doing for our clients.
So I guess that's my question, though, right? When you start talking about how we interact with these clients, what we're going to do with these clients, the truth is that there's often what I think of as the fog of war, which is you're talking in there, throwing ideas, you're trying to make sure things happen. It's spitballing of ideas, and then someone settles in on, okay, here's where we're going to land up. This is the direction we're going to go. And then what you're going to do is you're going to make sure it lines up from an MLR perspective, from your medical, legal, regulatory review perspective, that you've got your risks and your benefits appropriately outlined. If you're in the strategy phase, which I would imagine is what McKinsey did, I don't think McKinsey went out there and was pitching the product.
No. They did. There are instances in both cases where they did do ride-alongs with the reps. They did go out into the field. So in some ways, it's kind of unique in the sense that they were almost as if they were a pseudo marketing department of the pharmaceutical company.
But I think you have to draw that line between marketing and sales, don't you? In that marketing usually is everything we say will be reviewed because it's all going to be on paper or an ad, like an ad that goes out. Sales, on the other hand, is speaking, and that's where the list comes in. I'm asking, I guess, was as far as you know, McKinsey or Publicis, were they doing the ride-alongs in the capacity as sort of auditors, and they just did a bad job auditing?
No, they were doing it in a capacity to gain market data.
Interesting. But let's say they gained that market data. What makes them particularly liable? I mean, there's nothing wrong in getting market data.
No, I think it's then how does it translate into the messaging that you're suggesting the company do? So they were suggesting to de-emphasize the abuse risks. They were emphasizing targeting high prescribers only. They were emphasizing all the things that Purdue finally did to drive market share. And drive market share from at least what has been revealed in so far, driving market share from the standpoint of ignoring what was going on in the market with the crisis in real time. So they knew this was a problem. They knew that putting large volumes of these opioids out there were going to cause a problem. But all they were focused on was driving that market share, not dealing with the risks. And it wasn't, at least as the case is presented, they weren't giving a balance here. They were giving just, here's how to drive market share, guys.
So ethically speaking, obviously, assuming everything you're saying is right, that's just inappropriate. But legally speaking, do they have a duty to talk about balance? Because that balance the duty would fall in this specific case on Purdue, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the duty would fall with Purdue, but I do think, if all you're giving is the rosy picture and you know that there is a negative picture, I think if you're being a true trusted advisor, which is what consultants are supposed to be, you have a duty to point out the positives and the negatives.
So you're saying that they didn't, which is interesting. It's extending a new duty, which I'm not sure I've heard of before, which is consultants have a duty to now talk about risks and benefits, which has always fallen, legally speaking, only on the manufacturer.
Well, the duty fall, yeah, you're correct. I think it's a change in where the duty lies. I think consultants have always had a duty to balance their advice. I think consultants have always had a duty to be fair and balanced and objective as they can be. I think when I give advice, when I give advice to clients, it's not only do I give advice about the risks, but I will also point out, well, you can do this,
but these are the bad.
But these, this is where it's problematic.
Yeah.
It's not clear. It's gray. But at the same time, you need to be aware that you're not doing this in an environment where this is, where you can put a rubber stamp and say everything's okay. And I think consultants have a duty to say that.
I would agree with you ethically for sure. I'm struggling if a court would agree, because I've never seen that in any to me it wouldn't come under the the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act. I might argue so, and contract law doesn't require that. So where does that actually come from?
Well, they're arguing, at least in the Massachusetts case, with Publicis, that they're a public nuisance.
That's an interesting argument. So explain that. What is the public nuisance law, and how does that play out in this?
Well, it varies by state.
Okay.
So this is a state concept, but basically the public, and where you see public nuisance, for those of us who remember our law school days, it's how do you control pornography? How do you deal with the polluter factory? I mean, those are the real traditional public nuisances.
Sure.
This really started with the Oklahoma case with J&J. Washington's jumped on board. Massachusetts has jumped on board. saying, depending on their state laws, can we say that by dumping all of this product into the marketplace and knowing that it was going to cause harm, you guys are essentially acting as a public nuisance? I'm oversimplifying, but that's pretty much the gist of it.
The gist is that you should have known better. You put this, you allowed and enabled these products to go into the market, and that constitutes a public nuisance, and therefore we're going to hold
right. And you did that through false advertising and misleading advertising and incentives to doctors. And
let's play you being the DOJ, me being Publicis or McKinsey for the second. My argument would be I didn't do that. I was hired to tell Purdue how to raise the, and just to be clear, I've never worked for either one of those, but I'm playing this out. I was hired to talk about how to raise awareness. I did that. I was not hired to tell them the risks. I was not hired to say there's all this other work, because that would have changed the amount of money I would have charged them. That would have changed what I would, if I would have even been hired. They would have said, stay within your lane. That's not what I'm asking you for. We already know the risks.
And I think they were being used more as what you and I would consider the in-house marketing department.
Explain how that plays out. They were considered the in-house but they didn't review ads or create ads, did they?
No, but I do believe they created some sort of marketing material for them, but they certainly created the plan for which the marketing material was then created. So they created the marketing plan.
Okay.
And they pushed this and they really pushed this marketing plan.
Sure. But you don't have to talk about risks in a marketing plan. You have to talk about the benefits in the market, well, or at least the direction or the operational element of the marketing plan. The actual pieces would end up being part of the actual advertising piece that goes along with it. And again, we haven't seen, neither you nor I, as far as I know, have seen the actual pieces, and we don't have details on what actually happened there. But we're just sort of playing this out. So what?
And to be clear, what I'm basing my comments on, Darshan, is the complaints that have been filed. So what I've seen of the actual
which I think would
pleadings, which
enough.
Of course is only one side. So we haven't seen what they can come up with for a defense.
Fair point. So let's take that second part of this, which is what they can come up with for a defense. But before we do defense, both you and I work in the compliance space. So are you seeing more of us going out there and talking to ad agencies and talking to consulting companies? Because let's be honest, DOJ is not typically going after one and two man shops. They're going after the McKinseys because they want to make an example out of it.
Yes, and again, these are more state settlements that we're talking about. These are state governments going after the because one of the big changes, as we've seen with the opioids, is that while the feds have pressed certain cases, Purdue, Insys, there are a handful of others. By and large, this is being driven at the state level.
Why do you think the states are doing this when the federal government is not? Usually the states just follow the federal government, ride the coattails.
Because the states are the ones who are paying for the fallout. They're paying the EMTs. They're paying for naloxone. They're paying for addiction treatment. They're covering all these costs that they're not getting reimbursed by the federal government for any of it. And it's taking a toll on their communities, and they're looking to pay for it.
So this is them really trying to address their rising medical costs. Is that fair?
I think a large part, yes. I think it is. I think it's also the fact that they have also seen, I've seen a rise in state actions in other areas as well, where the feds have decided that they're not pressing it hard enough, or they don't want to press it. And the states are going, you're not, again, each state has a duty to protect the public health and welfare of its own citizens. And they're saying, okay, well, federal government, if you're not going to do it, we're going to do
it. Is this an opportunity, you think, for, and this is, I'll be fully honest, this is caused due to me watching Billions last night. but is this an opportunity for state attorney general's offices to make their names?
Absolutely. No question about
it. So this is, and again, I'm not questioning. I feel like I'll give you a example of where I feel. So as you know, I'm a pharmacist as well, and one of the things I struggled with was I'd gone to India and I landed up meeting a friend. So I was working in a hospital in the U.S. I went back to India and met a friend. He's a physician there, and it's interesting. The patient had just been through diabetic foot surgery.
Okay.
And they gave him ibuprofen. And I was like, that's ridiculous. You can't give someone who's gone through foot surgery ibuprofen. And me and my then wife, my current ex-wife, laughed at that situation, going, I can't believe that is okay. Like, that's the standard of care there. On the other hand, he was like, no, this is normal here, and patients deal with it fine. And in retrospect, I still can't tell whether I was fooled, if I should have known better, or it was just standard of care. That's what I saw every doctor doing for every patient and the like. So I guess it comes for me, I guess I'm looking at the opioid crisis and going, at the physician level, at the prescriber level, at the pharmacist level, how do you decide what is appropriate? What is the standard of care versus, because pain is not something that we can calculate. The best thing you have are these pictographs where you go, how do you feel? Super smiley or not as smiley? So if we were doing this right, and you are a pharmaceutical company, and let's say you want to educate people, do you kind of go, until you feel less smiley, number 7, don't ask for any opioids? Like, how do you prescribe that? How do you do this right if you're trying to be a good pharmaceutical company?
I think a couple of things you do right, Darshan, is one is where your sales reps pick up on signals, for example, that a doctor really isn't seeing patients, he's just writing scripts. The traditional pill mill, for want of a better way to put it. I think at that point you have to start to say, should we be selling to this individual? Should we be calling on this individual? It's clear that this person isn't necessarily doing their patients a service. I think there are lots of patients. Look, I think the dilemma here is, number one, there aren't really good alternatives between opioids at the very top of the medication and, say, Tylenol at the bottom or ibuprofen. The middle ground has been kind of blank for many years. We're not seeing a whole lot of new compounds coming out. I think it's one of the unfortunate parts of the cannabis scenario that potentially cannabis could fit somewhere in that middle, and we're only seeing it being allowed and really tested at the state level. We're not really seeing it. We're not seeing any real programs from a federal level perspective, because it's still a Schedule I controlled substance, and there's the belief it has absolutely no medical use, despite the fact that there's certainly I think a substantial body of evidence to say, while most of it's anecdotal, maybe there's something here, and maybe we need to test it in a real, true, controlled clinical trial setting now to see whether it really is effective or not. And then if it is, figure out a way to approve it. But we're not seeing that. I think the manufacturers and distributors are also in a kind of a rock and hard place, because once you see that what you think is bad behavior, who do you report it to? Do you go tell DEA? Do you go tell DOJ? Do you go tell FDA? I think there's a quandary for a good company that's trying to do the right thing. But I think the company itself has to make that decision as to whether or not who it sells to, and whether it's comfortable with those selling practices. A good company doesn't want to drive sales only. They want to drive sales to the right patients.
Correct.
And if they have a sense that that's not happening, then they're not doing the patients who shouldn't be getting their product any services by allowing that to happen. If they have ability to adjust course. I think you also need to figure out how to make sure that if your sales reps see those things and report those things, that they don't get penalized for that, because don't forget, they're making money on their bonuses and they're making money on what they sell. So if they lose the doctor who is in their territory that is 50% of their target, they are going to take they're going to have a negative financial benefit unless you make adjustments. And I think you have to make adjustments for that, especially if you really want to say you want your sales reps to do is sell and sell correctly, not just sell. Not just sell to anybody who will write the script, but sell to the right doctors, the ones that are trying to do the right thing, that are, not just giving this stuff out like candy. And again, I'm oversimplifying.
Of course. But one of the things I think is fascinating is an example of where that happened and happened wrongly. I forget which company it was, but it was in the news that it was a distributor that distributed something like 6 times the amount of OxyContin required to kill all the people in the county.
Right.
To that county.
There's plenty of data points like that. These numbers. The scary part of this is the numbers are not close. I mean, these aren't narrow bands we're talking about. We're talking about amounts and quantities and quotas, however you want to frame it, where somebody somewhere should have said, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Why is the pharmacy in West Virginia asking for this amount of product? What's really going on here? And I think I think the signals were there. I just don't think people paid attention to the signals or wanted to pay attention to the signals, which is my bias on this.
We have to bring you on to discuss this further, because we haven't even touched the surface yet. And usually, like I said, I aim for about 15 to 20 minutes, and we are at almost double that right now.
Wow.
So
yeah, we could talk about this for hours.
Right. As I told you, there are 4 general questions I tend to ask my my audience or my guests. The first question: is there a question you'd like to ask the audience based on what we discussed?
Yeah, I think from my perspective would be, how do we improve the relationship between the compliance folks, because that's what I do, and the business folks, such that the business folks will listen. I'm not saying they will always take the advice, but they at least listen. I think what scares me the most are situations where compliance isn't getting listened to at all. I'm not saying that we're always right, because we're not, and I'm not always saying that they always have to take the advice, which they don't. But I do think what scares the living daylights out of me are the business folks that take risks without really understanding the risks that they're taking. Yeah. And those have grave consequences, not only for the company and themselves, but also ultimately, at the end of the day, the losers in this are the patients. Because if the company gets shut down and no longer makes the medicine, the patients lose the source of the medicine.
I like to answer the question just as a first shot so that people know what options are. My answer would be help address the issue of trust. I think compliance, we're so quick to say no.
Yes, we are.
That companies kind of don't want to ask us those questions because we may say no. And,
no, as you know, Darshan, no's the easy answer.
Correct.
I mean, the easiest thing for any compliance person to say is no.
Right.
The hard part is to say no, but.
Or no, here's how you do it.
Yeah, I get your objective. I get what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
The way you want to do it or the way you're proposing to do it is going to get you into some real serious trouble. But if you do it slightly differently, you can probably get to that same objective but stay out of the trouble.
Yeah.
As I tell my clients, my job is to tell you where the sidelines are and keep you in bounds at all times and give you the widest possible playing field to play on. As long as you're in bounds, that's great. And go do what you do best, which is the business part of the world. My job is to tell you where the sidelines are and keep you from going out of bounds.
Agreed. Second question for you.
Yeah.
What did you learn this week?
I think what I learned this week, again, when I was working on the course that we're working on, is that if you look at the data around the opioid crisis, one of the interesting things that you see is that although deaths due to prescription opioids have gone down like 4.5% roughly in the last 10 years, deaths from synthetic opioids, fentanyl in particular, have gone up almost 1,000, a little more than 1,000%. So what's really driving the crisis, in fact, you have to look at it in phases. So if you say the early 1990s to the mid 2000s, a lot of it was fueled by oxycodone, hydrocodone, oxycontin, the traditional opioids, and heroin as well. And then you start to look at where we are today, you see it's less to do with prescription opioids and a lot more to do with the synthetic stuff, the fentanyl.
Okay. Ooh, okay. And sorry, I keep hearing. So I live in Philadelphia, as you know, Seth, and we keep having the cars buzz by us, the ATVs. So I keep trying to go, try to kill my volume as often as I can.
Understand.
The other question I'd want to ask you is, what has made you happiest in the last month?
Oh, I think being able to get out and see people again has started to make me happy again. It's the little things, like being able to go out with my wife to breakfast somewhere. Yeah.
Very, very cool. Seth, so I'm gonna just recap the conversation we had. We actually landed up talking about your summer course. We landed up talking about the opioid crisis.
Yep.
We very briefly touched on essentially manufacturer defenses and distributor defenses, but really talked a lot more about the McKinsey's and the Publicis and the consultant liability that goes along with it that we're now seeing. You touch on multi-district litigation, and we talked a lot more about this new emerging public nuisance law that's being reinterpreted as a new theory of defense, especially in this context. We talked a little bit about the difference between advertising and pushing, and the distinction being on addiction potential and the role that companies and compliance departments have to play as we continue. Did I miss anything?
No, I think you got it all.
Awesome. So as we mentioned earlier, nothing in this podcast should be legal or clinical advice. It's intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. For those of you who missed it, Seth, where can they find you?
You can find me. My email is swhitelaw@whitelawcompliance.com. You can find me on the web. You can find me through LinkedIn.
There you go. If you like this podcast, please leave a comment, please subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or go to our website at darshantalks.com. Seth, this was awesome having you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.